She was standing on the railing when he saw her. The east wing balcony of Morrow Hall faced a courtyard of pale gravel and winter-flattened grass, and in the gray light of an October morning, it was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to happen. A gardener's barrow stood abandoned near the gate. Frost still clung to the stone urns on either side of the balcony door. And above the courtyard, 20 feet up, a young woman in a white dress was balanced on the iron railing, with her eyes closed, and both hands gripping the stone balustrade behind her, gathering herself for something she had decided upon before the bells rang for 6. She did not hear him cross the gravel below. She did not hear the sharp intake of breath, or the 3 fast strides, or the low, urgent word he said that was not quite her name because he did not yet know her name. She only felt the railing shift under her feet as she let go, and then the sky tilted. And then there were arms around her, very solid and very cold from the morning air, and the ground never arrived the way she had imagined it would. What she did not yet know was that the man holding her had come to Morrow Hall for 30 acres of disputed land, and that he would leave it with something he had not anticipated, and that the folded letter in his coat pocket, unopened for 3 years, would meet a fire before the season turned. He set her down. She stepped back. She looked up at him with the particular expression of someone who has been caught doing something private and cannot decide whether to be relieved or furious. He looked at her for a long moment and said nothing. His face was the kind of face that gave nothing away on purpose, the jaw set, the gray eyes level, the expression so thoroughly composed that the effort of composing it was itself visible to anyone paying attention. He was 31 years old, and he wore no cravat yet, and his coat was riding dusty, which meant he had arrived either very early or very late, and had not troubled to change. He was, though Cecily did not know it yet, Julian Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, and the 30 acres he had come to argue over with Lady Morrow's solicitor shared a fence line with the eastern edge of the very hall whose white dress she was now wearing. He said, "Come inside before someone sees you." She said nothing. She was still breathing too fast, and her hands were still gripping the front of his coat. And she had the dazed, blank look of someone who had made a plan and arrived at the moment after the plan without any idea what happened next. "Come inside," he said again. It sounded like a command. She would come to understand that it was something else. Cecily Hartwell was 23 years old. Her father, Reverend George Hartwell of Shropshire, had died in August of a fever that moved faster than anyone had predicted. And in the weeks after the funeral, it became clear that he had left behind a debt of £4,000 owed to Lord Henry Prentice, a man of 40 with a flat effect and a habit of standing too close. Lord Prentice held the note. Lord Prentice had held it, apparently, for 4 years, an arrangement Cecily's father had entered in a moment of financial desperation and had never quite managed to escape. The note had come due on the 1st of September. There was no estate to sell, no living to transfer, nothing but the contents of the rectory, and Cecily herself and her younger sister Nora, who was 16, and who had nowhere to go if Cecily's arrangements failed. Lady Georgiana Morrow, Cecily's aunt by marriage to her father's eldest brother, had presented the situation with the brisk clarity of a woman who considers herself kind because she is honest. She had written in early September. She had said that Lord Prentice was willing to settle the debt in exchange for the marriage. She had said that this was not a punishment, but a resolution. She had said that Nora's welfare depended on Cecily's cooperation, and she had used the word cooperation with the same tone a person uses when they mean compliance and want credit for the softer word. Cecily had read the letter 4 times. She had then written back and asked whether there was any alternative. Lady Morrow had replied that she herself could not absorb £4,000 and had underlined the word herself. And that was the end of the alternatives. So Cecily had arrived at Morrow Hall in the second week of October, with a trunk of dresses that needed retrimming and a sister she was determined to keep safe. And she had spent 2 weeks being fitted and consulted and arranged, and Lord Prentice had visited twice and stood too close both times. And the wedding had been set for the morning of the 23rd, and on the morning of the 23rd, at 5:20, Cecily had found herself in the East Corridor, thinking with unusual clarity that she could not do it. She had not planned the balcony. She had gone out for air and found herself climbing, which was the kind of action that made sense in the moment, and no sense at all from the outside, except that the outside had been pressing inward for 2 months, and some part of her had simply needed to press back. Julian brought her inside through a side door she had not previously known existed. He led her down a passage she did not recognize to a room in the east wing that was clearly not in regular use. A small sitting room with holland covers still on 2 of the chairs, and a fire that had been laid, but not yet lit. He lit it. She stood in the center of the room in her wedding dress, and watched him. "You are the Hartwell girl," he said, without turning from the fire. "I am Cecily Hartwell," she said. He looked over his shoulder at the correction. Something in his face shifted, so briefly that she might have imagined it, and then it was composed again. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you going to tell me what you intended by standing on that railing?" She considered a number of answers and discarded all but the true one. "I intended to leave." He rose from the fire and turned to face her fully. He was. She registered with the distant clarity of someone who has recently decided to be frightened of nothing. A very large man who was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. "The wedding is in 3 hours, he said. "Yes." "And you meant to walk away across the courtyard in your wedding dress and go where, exactly?" She had not thought that far. She did not say so. "I have not decided." He looked at her for a long moment, the gray eyes doing that still, assessing thing that she had already learned to distrust because it gave no information back. Then he said, "Stay in this room. I will send someone with tea. Do not go near the balcony." It was not warm. It was not even kind, precisely. But it put a locked door between her and Lord Prentice, and she was 23 years old and exhausted. And she sat down on one of the uncovered chairs and accepted the tea when it came. And that was how she came to be in Julian Ashford's temporary keeping on the morning of what was supposed to have been her wedding day. He had told no one. That was the first thing she understood. The maid who brought the tea was his, not the household's, a small practical woman named Bessie, who said nothing unnecessary and did not look at the wedding dress with the expression Cecily feared. The second thing she understood was that he had business at Morrow Hall that had nothing to do with her. She learned this by listening through the connecting wall to what was clearly a tense exchange between Julian and a solicitor about a boundary fence and 30 acres of land on the eastern edge of the estate, and she gathered from the solicitor's increasingly agitated tone that the dispute was not going well for the solicitor. Lady Morrow, she learned by mid-morning, had told the household that the bride was indisposed, and the ceremony was delayed until evening. It was the kind of story that required everyone involved to pretend it was not a story, and Lady Morrow was very good at that kind of pretending. Cecily spent the morning in the sitting room. She had brought nothing from her room because she had not planned this, so she sat by the window with the fire at her back and watched the gravel courtyard and thought about Nora. Nora was in the hall somewhere. Nora had not been told. Nora believed, presumably, that her sister was resting before the afternoon ceremony, not sitting in a stranger's wing in a wedding dress drinking cold tea. Cecily turned this thought over for a long time, the way one handles something sharp, carefully, and without panic. Julian came back at noon. He had changed his coat and tied his cravat, and he brought the solicitor's file under his arm, and he sat down across from her at the small writing table as though this were entirely ordinary. He said, "Tell me about the debt." She told him. She was precise because she had had 2 months to be precise. £4,000, held since Nora was 12, the note signed in a year, when the roof at the rectory had needed replacing, and her father had been too proud to ask the parish for relief. She told him about Lord Prentice's visits to the Hall, and the way he had looked at Nora on the second visit, and then looked at Cecily with an expression that meant he had noticed what mattered most to her. Julian's jaw tightened. It was a small thing, barely visible, but she had been watching his face because it was the only source of information available to her in a day that had offered very little, and she catalogued it. "And Lady Morrow," he said. "My aunt by marriage believes she is being practical," Cecily said. "She may even believe she is being kind." She stopped. "She is not unkind. She simply cannot afford to see past the arithmetic." He looked at her then with an attention that felt different from his previous attention, less assessing, and more something she did not have an immediate name for, and she did not know that he had been watching her for the better part of an hour. The previous afternoon for reasons that had nothing to do with the boundary dispute, and everything to do with the particular quality of her steadiness, which was the kind of steadiness that is always also a controlled form of grief. She did not know because he showed her nothing, He said, "The ceremony has been moved to this evening. You have today." "To do what?" "To decide whether you want to do it." She looked at him. "I already decided." "Then decide again," he said, and left. If you are moved by Cecily's particular kind of courage, the kind that does not announce itself, stay with the story. There is a great deal more to see. She did not decide again. What she did instead was ask Bessie to bring Nora to her, which Bessie accomplished with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has navigated difficult households before and knows that the simplest path is often also the least visible one. Nora arrived at 1:30 in a blue afternoon dress, with her hair only half done and her eyes very wide. She took one look at Cecily in the sitting room in the wedding dress that had not moved from the chair by the window, and said, with the directness of 16, "You look terrible." "Thank you," Cecily said. "Sit down." Nora sat. Cecily told her some of it, not all, and watched Nora's face do the thing it did when Nora was frightened and refusing to show it, which was the same thing Cecily's own face did, and which she had apparently taught her sister without intending to. She told Nora that she was not going to marry Lord Prentice. She told her that she did not yet know what would happen instead. She told her that she needed Nora to trust her for one more day. Nora said with great care, "What about the £4,000? "I do not know yet," Cecily said. Nora looked at the floor, then at the window, then at Cecily. "I could go to Mrs. Plover's," she said. Mrs. Plover ran a school for young women outside Shrewsbury, and Nora had a friend there, and this was Nora's way of saying that she was 16 and not made of glass, and that Cecily should not have to ruin herself for her. Cecily took her sister's hand. "You will not go to Mrs. Plover's," she said. "Not like that." After Nora left, Cecily asked Bessie for paper and a pen. She spent an hour composing 3 letters to 3 different people who might conceivably loan £4,000 to the daughter of a dead country rector on no security whatsoever, and she knew, as she wrote each one, that the answer would be no. She wrote them anyway. It was while she was at the writing table with ink on her fingers that Lady Morrow arrived. She came alone, which was interesting, and she closed the door behind her, which was more so. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of understanding how much bearing is worth in a room, and she surveyed the sitting room and Cecily's ink-stained fingers with one comprehensive glance. "His Grace has been accommodating," she said, meaning Julian. "But the situation cannot continue past this evening." "No," Cecily agreed. Lady Morrow sat. She folded her hands. She said with genuine and terrible kindness, "Cecily, you are 23 years old. Your father left nothing. Your options are precisely what I have told you they are. Lord Prentice is not a cruel man." "He looked at Nora," Cecily said. Lady Morrow's expression shifted very slightly. "He is to be your husband, not Nora's." "He looked at her," Cecily said again, "in a way that told me he had calculated her as a contingency." Silence. "I will give you £50, Lady Morrow said then quietly, "to cooperate, to not make this difficult this evening. £50 to put by for Nora's future." Cecily looked at her aunt's face and saw in it the genuine conviction that this was a fair offer, that £50 was something, that she was doing what was necessary and reasonable, and that Cecily's resistance was an indulgence the situation could not sustain. "No," Cecily said. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain further. She picked up her pen and returned to her letter. And after a moment, Lady Morrow stood and left, and the room was quiet again. And Cecily finished the sentence she had been writing and sat back and looked at the fire. She did not see the man in the doorway of the connecting passage who had come to retrieve a document from the side table and had instead stood very still through the entirety of what had just transpired. She did not see the way he looked at her after Lady Morrow's footsteps had faded down the corridor, the way he stood with one hand on the doorframe as though he needed the weight of it, as though something he had arranged carefully inside himself had shifted and required a moment to resettle. She did not see him take the folded letter from his coat pocket, briefly, and then put it back. She did not see any of it. What she knew of Julian Ashford at the end of that first day was almost nothing. He was the Duke of Ashford. He had come for 30 acres. He issued instructions in a tone that sounded like coldness and functioned like a wall he had built around something that could be hurt. He had not asked her to leave, and he had not asked her to thank him, and he had not said or done anything that could be read, with any confidence, as caring whether she stayed or went. The caring, which was what it was and what he did not intend to name, had begun in the courtyard when she fell, and it had nothing to do with the 30 acres. 3 years before the morning of Cecily's failed wedding, Julian had been responsible for the welfare of a boy named Thomas, the 11-year-old son of his closest friend, whose parents had both died of typhus within a week of each other in the summer of 1812. Julian had brought Thomas to Ashford Park. He had arranged tutors and a pony and a room with a good view of the park's south lawn. He had done all the practical things that rank and money made possible, and he had believed, because he was a person who had spent his life trusting in practical things, that this was sufficient. Thomas had died of a chill that turned to fever in March of 1813. He had been ill for 11 days, and Julian had been in London for 9 of them, attending to the estate's parliamentary interests, and by the time he had returned, the physician had already told the household that there was nothing more to be done. The boy had died on a Tuesday morning. He had been 12 years old. The letter in Julian's coat pocket was from Thomas's paternal aunt, written 6 months later, in which she absolved Julian of any fault and thanked him for the care he had given her nephew. He had never opened it. He carried it because the weight of it was familiar, and because to open it felt like accepting a verdict he had not finished delivering to himself. His coldness was not cruelty, and it was not arrogance. It was the particular discipline of a man who had learned that attachment produced specific costs he was not willing to pay again, and who had organized his life around that conviction with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else. He had not, until this morning, encountered anyone who was doing the same thing and making it look like courage rather than armor. At 3 o'clock, he went to find Cecily again. She was still at the writing table. 3 letters were stacked and sealed at her elbow. She had changed out of the wedding dress, which meant Bessie had managed something, and she was wearing a plain gray wool that was neat and entirely at odds with the formality of the hall around it. And she did not look up when he came in. He sat across from her. He looked at the 3 letters and did not ask. She said, without looking up, "I know you cannot keep me here." "No. And I know that whatever you have arranged with Lady Morrow has a limit." "This evening," he said. "Yes." She looked up then. Her eyes were dark brown, which he had not registered precisely until now, and they had the quality of someone who has spent a considerable time being looked past and has stopped expecting anything different. The specific quality of that look did something to the arranged interior of his chest that he did not examine. "Tell me about the letter," she said, and he went very still. She said, "I saw you take it out. This afternoon, when Lady Morrow left." She stopped. "I did not mean to see it." The door was open. He was quiet for so long that she began to turn back to her letters. Then he said, "It is from a woman who wished to tell me I was not to blame for something. I have not read it." Cecily put down her pen. "Why not?" "Because I am not finished deciding whether she is correct." She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at things that required her full attention without allowing the attention to show on her face. "What is it that you believe you did wrong?" "I was not there," he said. "When it mattered." Cecily was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon had gone the dark copper color of an October dusk, and the fire had burned low. "I have spent 2 months," she said, "being told that my father's debt is my obligation to resolve. I have spent 2 months being told that my feelings about the resolution are a luxury the situation cannot afford. And the thing I have noticed is that the people who tell me this are always the people who will not have to live with the resolution." He did not say anything. "You were not there," she said. "I believe you. I believe it cost you. I believe it costs you still." She looked at the fire. "But whoever wrote that letter was also not there when it mattered. And they have decided something about your fault anyway. And they took the trouble to tell you, and you have been carrying it in your pocket for 3 years, instead of letting yourself find out whether it is bearable." He said nothing for a very long time. The fire crackled. The light came and went across the Holland covers on the 2 chairs near the window. At last he said, with a precision that sounded like he was holding it carefully, "You are a governess for a young woman who has nothing to do with your own trouble, in a house where no one has asked you to teach her anything, while your own life is being arranged around you, without your consent." "She is my sister," Cecily said. "Yes," he said. "I know." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of 2 people who have said more than they planned and are sitting with the weight of it. That evening, Lady Morrow assembled the household for what she had announced as a small private supper to precede the rescheduled ceremony. Approximately 40 people attended, which was a small private supper by Lady Morrow's measure, and Cecily stood at the edge of the drawing room in the gray wool dress and watched Lord Prentice across the room and felt nothing that resembled resignation, which was what she had been trying to arrange in herself all day, and a great deal that resembled a cold, clear refusal she had nowhere to put. Julian was not in the room. She did not look for him. She had decided, somewhere between the letters and the low fire, and his voice saying I was not there, that his kindness was real and his limits were also real, and that depending on someone who had organized his life around not being depended on was a form of cruelty she would not visit upon herself. Lady Morrow called the assembly to attention at 7:30. She stood at the center of the room with the natural authority of a woman who has never had occasion to doubt that the room will arrange itself to listen. And she said that the evening ceremony would proceed as planned, and that she was pleased to welcome Lord Prentice to the family. And she looked at Cecily with an expression that was not cruel, but was absolutely certain. Cecily heard, "The girl has no real objection, only nerves," from somewhere behind her left shoulder, in the particular carrying murmur of someone who intended to be overheard. She had heard those words, or words closely related to them, 3 times now in the past 2 weeks. Once from Lady Morrow's sister-in-law in the blue parlor, once from Lord Prentice himself to Lady Morrow in the corridor outside the dining room, and now here, from a woman in yellow silk whose name she did not know, at the moment when the room had gathered to watch her be given. She stood perfectly still. She could feel the assembly's attention settling on her the way a weight settles, not unkind, simply heavy. The collective assumption of a room full of people who had already decided how this evening ended. Lord Prentice crossed toward her. He was smiling in the way he always smiled, with his mouth only. And he held out his hand, and Cecily looked at it, and the whole room waited. Then the door at the far end of the drawing room opened. Julian walked in. He was wearing his evening coat, which meant he had dressed for this, which meant this was not an accident. He walked across the room with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who has decided something and is executing the decision. And the assembly parted for him the way assemblies part for dukes, because rank is its own kind of weather. He walked directly to Cecily, not to Lady Morrow, not to Lord Prentice, directly to Cecily. And he stopped in front of her with his back to the room. He said quietly, "The magistrate is in the study." She said, "I beg your pardon?" "Magistrate Holm. He is reviewing the debt instrument with my solicitor. The note Lord Prentice holds contains a clause that my solicitor identified this afternoon, a clause which in fact voids the instrument on grounds of the original lender's misrepresentation at signing." He paused. "The note is not legitimate. The £4,000 is not legally owed." Behind her, she could hear the very precise silence of 40 people who had stopped speaking at the same moment. She could hear Lady Morrow's fan snap shut. "Prentice knew," Julian said. He said it simply, without emphasis, the way he said everything. He held an instrument he knew was defective and did not disclose the defect. Holm will confirm it before the evening is out. Lord Prentice said, from somewhere to Cecily's left, "This is an outrage." Julian did not turn. He kept his eyes on Cecily with a steadiness she recognized because she had been watching it all day and had been trying all day to determine what it meant. "There is one other matter," he said. "The 30 acres on the eastern boundary." He paused. "I have withdrawn my claim to them. They will be deeded to Morrow Hall as part of the settlement." Lady Morrow said, "Your Grace," in a voice that had lost its previous certainty. "The boundary dispute is resolved," Julian said, still to Cecily, "and my solicitor advises that the settlement agreement can be drawn before the week is out." Lord Prentice said something further, but Cecily did not hear it, because she was watching Julian's face, which had done something she had not seen it do. The composure was still there, but it was no longer sufficient, not entirely, and in the small gap between what he intended to show and what he was in fact showing, she could see something she had not expected to see, the space between his brows, the careful quality of his breathing. The hands he had clasped behind his back, which were, she now registered, not entirely still. He was afraid of this moment. He was afraid of it, and he was doing it anyway. "Miss Hartwell?" he said, and the room went completely quiet. He never used her Christian name. He had not yet. The formality of it was exact and deliberate, and it landed in the room with the weight of a man who understood exactly what he was about to say, and had said it anyway, irrevocably, in front of 40 witnesses. "I have no practice at asking for what I want," he said. "I find I'm doing it regardless." He reached into his coat pocket. Not for the letter. For a small folded paper that proved to be, she saw when she took it, a note in his own handwriting. 4 lines. She did not read them in front of the room. She did not need to, because his face had said them already, and her own hands had understood before her mind had caught up. She said, "You gave up 30 acres. Yes. For a woman you have known for 1 day." He said with a gravity that was not pompous, but rather was the gravity of a man who has thought very carefully about what he is about to say. "I have known you for 1 day. I have recognized you for rather longer. They are not the same." The room was silent. Lord Prentice made one more attempt, half turned toward Lady Morrow with the particular expression of a man who still believes the room will realign itself in his favor, if he can only locate the right appeal. But Lady Morrow was not looking at him. She was looking at Cecily. There was something in her face that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, but was perhaps the specific expression of a woman who has organized a great many things in her life and is watching one of them organize itself without her. Magistrate Holm appeared in the doorway. He was a composed man in his 60s who moved with the unhurried gravity of someone whose business is conducted in the presence of consequences, and he said, without preamble, that the debt instrument had been reviewed and found defective on the grounds Julian's solicitor had identified, and that Lord Prentice's claim against the Hartwell estate was void, and that he would require Lord Prentice's presence in the study at his earliest convenience to formalize the matter. Lord Prentice went. He went because there was nothing else to do in a room where the magistrate had spoken and the Duke of Ashford had made himself plain, and he went without looking at Cecily, which was the first thing he had done all evening that she did not have to steel herself against. The room, released from its long-held breath, began to speak again in the particular low-pitched murmur of people who have witnessed something they intend to discuss for the rest of the month. Lady Morrow crossed to Julian and said, "Your Grace." She stopped. She looked at Cecily for a moment with an expression that was, Cecily thought, as close to an apology as Lady Morrow's architecture would allow. And then she said, "I hope you know what you have done." And it was not entirely clear whether she meant Cecily or Julian, and it was not entirely clear that it mattered. Julian said, "Yes." Nora appeared at Cecily's elbow 20 minutes later, arriving from the direction of the back parlor where she had apparently been kept by Bessie out of the main assembly's reach, which was either Julian's arrangement or Bessie's own initiative, and both possibilities seemed equally characteristic of the people involved. Nora looked at Cecily. She looked at Julian. She looked back at Cecily with the comprehensive assessment of a 16-year-old who has been watching her elder sister carry too much for too long, and is both relieved and slightly incredulous that someone has intervened. She said, "You are not marrying Lord Prentice." "No," Cecily said. Nora looked at Julian again. "Are you the Duke of Ashford?" "I am," he said. "She tutored me all afternoon," Nora said, as though this were evidence. "In French and in arithmetic. She did not mention you once." "I was aware," he said, and the corner of his mouth did something brief and entirely unexpected, and Cecily looked at him in the way one looks at a very familiar landscape that has suddenly produced an unfamiliar feature, and thought, "There you are." They were married 3 weeks later, in a small church outside Kingsbridge, in a ceremony attended by the magistrate as witness and by Nora in her best blue dress and by Bessie, who stood in the back and approved of everything. Lady Morrow sent a letter that was carefully worded and did not quite apologize, and did not quite not apologize, and Cecily read it twice and then set it aside in the particular way one sets aside a thing that has ceased to have the power it once had. Ashford Park was a gray stone house on a hill above the valley, with 40 rooms Cecily did not yet know, and a library that smelled of beeswax and old leather, and which faced east so that the morning light came through it in long, flat bars that touched the spines of the books and left everything else in a comfortable dimness. She had gone there on the first morning at the house, before Julian was awake, and she had stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not stood in a room that felt safe in almost 6 months. The first snow came in the 3rd week of November. Cecily was in the library reading when she heard the change in the quality of the light. She looked up. Through the tall east windows, the park was acquiring a new whiteness, fine and tentative, the first proper snow of the year settling over the lawn and the bare branches of the lime trees and the stone urns along the garden wall. It was the kind of snow that fell quietly, without urgency, as though it had always been coming and had simply chosen this afternoon to arrive. Julian came in from the corridor. He had been with the solicitor again, this time about the settlement's final paperwork, and he had ink on his left hand. He crossed to the window and stood beside her, and they watched the snow settle without speaking, which was something they had discovered they could do very well, the two of them, and which was one of the small domestic facts she had begun to assemble like stones laid in a path. He reached into his coat. He took out the folded letter. She looked at it and then looked at him. He said, 3 years. Yes, she said. He held it for a moment. The letter was not sealed, had never been sealed, was only folded and folded again over time until the creases had gone soft, and he turned it once in his hand, and she could see the effort of it in the set of his shoulders and the steadiness he was applying to something that did not quite want to be still. She said nothing. This was his to do. He crossed to the fire. The library had a fireplace at the near end, small and practical, and the fire was burning at the even, steady pace it burned on a cold afternoon, and he stood before it for a moment, holding the letter, and then placed it in among the coals. The paper caught immediately. It went from white to gold to black to nothing in the space of a few seconds, and the fire continued exactly as before, and the snow continued outside the window, and Julian Ashford stood with his hands at his sides and watched the ash. Nora's voice came from the corridor, calling for Cecily, asking whether she had seen the snow, and Cecily turned toward the door, and Julian turned from the fire. And when their eyes met, there was something in his that had not been there before, something that was not ease precisely, but was the specific quality of a person who has put down something very heavy and is discovering, with surprise, that the world still holds. He said, "There is a hill on the south lawn where the snow will settle first." She said, "Show me." He did. The snow fell over Ashford Park through the long evening and the longer night, and by morning the hill on the south lawn was white and clean and unmarked, and the library fire had burned to embers, and then to ash, and then to a faint warmth still detectable in the grate, and Cecily's gray wool dress was hung on the chair by the east window where she had left it, and Nora was asleep in the blue room at the end of the hall, safe and entirely herself. Worth, in the end, does not require an audience. It requires one person who can see clearly. The lime trees stood in their new whiteness. The hill held its shape. and the folded letter, 3 years carried and one evening placed quietly in the fire, was gone at last, having never been read, and no longer needing to be. If Cecily's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that landed. This channel tells stories of women who endure quietly and are seen exactly once by exactly the right person. There are more stories here, and they are all waiting.